Catholic ancestors as I do, it didn't take me very long to realise when I began researching that the various Catholic Church registers that any family historian might need are not necessarily particularly easy to find. When I began researching my own family, I also began to appreciate that there were also some really quite logical reasons behind the fact that these Catholic registers are just not there often before the mid to late 1700s. After all, it wasn't until 1791 that the Catholic Relief Act finally allowed Catholics to have their own chapels and I think schools as well, and things were becoming a bit more tolerant towards Catholics in England and Wales. But a generation before this, people still really doubted that it was possible to be loyal to both the monarch and the Pope if you were a Catholic. They thought your loyalties just could not be divided like that. And in 1767 they actually drew up what they called a return of Papists, which was a bit like a census but just with Catholic people on it, which includes all sorts of information about their husbands, wives, children, sometimes servants, jobs, ages, and quite often as well it will tell you how many years or weeks sometimes they had been living in the area that they were in at the time when the return was taken. So it can be really useful from that perspective. Now 230 years before this, Henry VIII was making some huge changes across England and Wales. Most notably the beginnings of the English Reformation, and this is why from there on a lot of anti-Catholic laws were passed in the aftermath of this, especially in the reign of his daughter Elizabeth I. It all had to start somewhere, and effectively it really began with the period around sort of 1536 when the dissolution of the monasteries began. To prepare the ground for this dissolution, because it was going to be a huge project, in early 1535 a survey began. Henry VIII got his ministers to basically value each abbey to see what it was worth in monetary terms, the same for monasteries, priories, any other religious houses. And it is known as the Valor Ecclesiasticus, and that simply translates quite literally as church valuation. That's all it means. The original documents, I believe, are held at the National Archives, and they span an incredible 22 volumes. That's an awful lot of handwriting in the 1500s because there's no other option at that point. So the valuation must have been some task in itself. But just by chance, at least two of the abbeys that were dissolved during the beginnings of the Reformation are very, very close to where I live. So what else would I do on a spring bank holiday Monday but go out and explore the remains of an 870-year-old Sawley Abbey? So in the year 1148, William Percy, the son of Alan Percy the Great, wonderful name, founded a Cistercian abbey at Sawley. Historical details are a bit sketchy, but I think, from what I have managed to work out, that these are the distant ancestors of the people who became the Percy Earls of Northumberland. They're just many generations removed. And it is at this point in time that we get a record of the name of the first abbot at Sawley. His name was just written down as Benedict because they didn't have surnames in 1148. 36 others would follow him. The last abbot, William Trafford, was appointed in 1537, unfortunately for him, which is just a few months before Sawley Abbey was actually dissolved. And Benedict and his monk, interestingly, back in the 1100s, were not just given land at Sawley, the estate, if you want to call it that, extended a little further. Traditionally, religious houses were really supposed to offer hospitality to any visitors who asked for it, any travellers that might pass their way. Food, lodging, shelter, whatever was required. I think it was all part of setting a good Christian example, being charitable to those in need, helping anybody who asked for it. And from a visitor's perspective, Sawley Abbey was definitely in a good location. It is on the main road that leads out from Clitheroe towards York. Basically, this road was the forerunner of the A59, and if it was anything like that road is today, I imagine it was a busy route. Sawley Abbey is also very close to the River Ribble. And although I have absolutely no evidence to back this theory up that this is what people might have actually done, I think if I was trying to navigate my way around an unfamiliar area, I might also use a river for some sort of guidance, because you'd be able to work out roughly where it was going and follow the line if you could see it in the distance. So I could see why people might want to navigate by the river, and of course you've also got it being very useful for fishing perspective, clean water and all the other things that come with rivers. To make things slightly more annoying for the community at Sawley, in 1296, so it's about 150 years after Sawley Abbey was founded, their order, the Cistercians, decided to found another abbey. They relocated the original Stanlaw Abbey in Cheshire to Whalley, which is about 6 miles from Sawley. A little bit further if you actually follow the Ribble down. So of course the monks at Sawley were not all that happy about this, and they said that it was against the rules of the Cistercian order to have two religious houses so close together. And they also said that the land at Whalley, which they had previously farmed, was of course now being taken over by the incoming new religious community. Because this new community have moved in, it's actually affecting the Sawley community's ability to feed themselves and farm lands and maybe even make a bit of profit in order to sell produce and get some money in for the abbey that way. And in the end, the Cistercian officials got together and decided that the Whalley community should sell any surplus goods to their brothers at Sawley at the standard market rate, so they were making no profit on this really, and this seems to have been sufficient to solve the problem, fortunately. Other historical documents also tell us that in 1335 masses were being said at Sawley Abbey, as they spelt it, for a man named Robert of Clitheroe, who had been the rector of the parish church in Wigan, so that's a good distance away. He'd been rector there from September of 1303 until his death on the 4th of June 1334, and when he died, Robert was actually brought all the way back to Sawley, where he was buried at the abbey. So if he was Robert of Clitheroe, it's quite logical that he had some connection to the Clitheroe and Sawley area, I think. But it certainly leaves you in absolutely no doubt that people could and did travel quite a long way even 700 years ago, even if they had to go on foot. The Lancashire Archives online catalogue tells me that amongst various documents relating to the Wells family of Stonyhurst, there is some paperwork dating from 1376 which says that John, who is the abbot of Sawley, again they're spelling it Sally, was mentioned in this document which described a hall on the north side of the abbey's church which was named the cellar. It was 63 feet long and 24 feet broad, so that is quite a sizable cellar, and there's obviously plenty of room there for storing provisions. It must have been a kind of storeroom. Looking at a modern map, the north side of the abbey is on the side where the Spread Eagle pub is, but then again, so is the abbey's church. I don't think that the cellar is going to be underneath the church somehow, but maybe it was just somewhere close by and convenient. This bit here that we've just been looking at is actually the Abbey Church, as it was supposed to have been. And they had 7 daily church services. The night stair apparently can be seen directly opposite, which allows access to the dormitory on the first floor. I wonder whether these are the steps that went up to the dormitory. It's the only set of steps I can see, so it does make a bit of sense that that's where they might have been. I don't think I'm going to try and climb them. I'm not sure how safe they are. Now, Sawley Abbey has got quite an interesting tower, I think, from what I've seen on my explorations. And from what I can make out, this sort of tower-shaped object, building, would have led into the lay brothers' dormitory. Apparently there was a separate dormitory for the monks on the other floor, so there's two dormitories separating the religious order from the non-religious inhabitants, the ones that haven't taken holy orders. There were also cloisters there, and they were sort of near what looks to have been a small courtyard. You can sort of make out where these places are looking at the stonework that's left in the ground, so it's quite interesting to go and explore it, I thought. And more importantly of all, you can make out where the refectory is. Of course, that is where they would have eaten, and from the map that I've managed to find online, I think that the kitchens were actually next to the refectory, which makes perfect sense, having the kitchen next to what is essentially the dining room. So there is evidence to show that by the year 1381 there were 16 other monks at Sawley as well as the abbot, so it wasn't an enormous community, but it may well have been quite a typical size for that point in history. I mean, I suppose we have to remember that the Black Death had just been and gone, and that had a massive impact on the population of Europe, so there would have been just generally fewer people then than there are today. Actually, by the time the abbey was dissolved, some sort of 150 or so years later, there were 21 monks and also 37 servants there. And when Henry VIII came to dissolve the monasteries and the abbeys, he has this Valor Ecclesiasticus drawn up and in 1534, and it's an interesting document. Where a property, an abbey, a religious house was valued at over £200, you get more specific details about it. Where an abbey is valued at a little less than £200, you might not get so much information. Now Sawley was valued at under £200, so it wasn't that wealthy in the grand scheme of things. But actually there is a figure from the Valor Ecclesiasticus suggesting that it was worth £147, 3 shillings and 10pence, which might not seem like a lot of money today, but is actually 2.25 million or thereabouts. It's not enormous, but it's probably larger than many small businesses today, I suppose is the best way you can compare it. And there is a record actually that the last abbot of Sawley, one William Trafford, took part in the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, which I always imagined was a fairly peaceful protest. I think the idea was that a group of people from the north of England, who of course objected to all their abbeys and monasteries and other convents being closed down, they thought that the best thing to do was to go south peacefully, to make the stand, to meet Henry VIII, which I believe they actually did, to put their case forward, and they genuinely believed that he would sit down and listen to them. They really thought they could come to some sort of agreement. Unfortunately, Henry VIII didn't really see it that way. I think he made a few promises, but he had absolutely no intention of keeping them. So sadly for William Trafford, he was executed for high treason at Lancaster on the 10th of March 1537, on the very same day as John Paslew, who was the abbot of Sawley, which again is not too far from Sawley. And they both ended their lives together. But certainly when I looked at Sawley Abbey just this last couple of days, and I'm walking around it, one thing that occurred to me is that if you take away all the modern buildings and all the things that they didn't have in the 1100s to the 1500s, it must have been the only major building for miles around. I could imagine that it was probably a really peaceful place to be, at least until the dissolution happened. So perhaps it won't be too long before I come up with something else that we can look at in the local area, or maybe I will come up with a new project on family history lines, and I will see where that goes. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.